Now, you're going to hold the guns just like that. Now, of course, these aren't real. These are for show. There we go. And since you're going to be simulating being a gunner...
Margaret Cook's been waiting 60 years to get into this cockpit. Last time she saw a Helldiver bomber, she was too busy building it to go joyriding.
That feel comfortable?
Good, great.
Okay. And when we take off, of course, it'll tend to kind of slide you backwards for a minute, but then once we're in level flight, it should be okay.
No problem at all.
You comfy?
You bet.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go get my flight suit on, and we're going to pre-flight the airplane, and we'll be taking off in a few minutes.
Fine.
All righty.
I'm ready.
Look forward to flying with you.
Thank you. I look forward to flying with you. I feel like an air gunner.
Oh my, that's so nice to see my old plane. Oh dear.
That's beautiful.
To be with them.
Beautiful
really
to see it.
Part of us. They're part of our life. I couldn't help but cry, you know. I felt so sentimental about the darn thing. Yeah. The little buggers, they were so nice. They brought us together, right? Oh yeah. We women did a good job. But you know, the men, they thought they knew it all, but they didn't they? Isn't that right?
This is a war story about fighters and bombers and the Battle of Britain and the war in the Pacific. But it all takes place about as far from London or Iwo Jima as you can get, smack in the middle of the Canadian bush. Today, it's part of Thunder Bay, but in those days, it was just Fort William, Lakehead Port and lumber town. There wasn't even a road to the rest of Canada. Not one you'd risk your last silk stockings on, anyway. Then along came a couple of airplanes that would put us on the map and give us a whole new way to look at our lives. In the middle of 1940, the news from Europe was downright scary.
From airfields all along the conquered coasts of Europe, wave on wave of Goering's bombers launched their long-awaited assault on England. Their tactic, to drive the RAF from British skies, to spread civilian panic, prepare the way for the invading army. Their Heinkels had thundered over Poland, their Dorniers had blasted Holland, their Stukas had shattered the army of France. Only Britain remained. Long will England remember the days when the Spitfires and the Hurricanes first roared in, and the fortunes of war were written in white trails of vapor in the sky.
A few fast little fighters, most of them Hawker Hurricanes, were all that stood between Britain and a full-scale German invasion. But they were getting shot down just about as fast as they could take off. If the jackboots weren't to march across the Channel, Britain was going to need help. That's where we came in. Canadian factories and Canadian workers could mean the difference between survival and disaster.
In a war where the loss of precious equipment may bring swift defeat, this is Canada's greatest task, to mobilize her mighty industrial resources into a never-failing arsenal. And on this battlefront of national organization, women fight side by side with men.
You bet we did. More than 1 million of us between 1939 and 1945. And by the time it was all over, we'd shaken up a lot more than the Nazis. When it came to building airplanes, we women did just about every job there was. From soldering fuse panels, like Margaret Cook, and building the wings, like Nina Harney, who riveted the sheet metal skins with her partner, Mary Sundell, or wrestling an acetylene torch to weld the frames, like Irene DePiro.
Women were steadier welders. It didn't go over well with the men, but we were. And we also were more apt to show up every day.
That's right.
Oh, yeah,
we were there and never
day.
missed a day.
Never took days off.
Never took
Regardless
days
of
off.
shift and all, even though we ran out fast at 12 to go to the dance for an hour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They understand the meaning of their united effort as they watch the miracle of a modern plane take shape.
And there's the Herc again.
There's the Herc again.
Mount McKay in the background.
Oh, yes, there it is. Isn't that nice?
Lovely.
Look at that nice. Imagine us building that plane. And it was a real experience.
Yes. It's always impressive, wasn't it, to see the aircraft? I know you had a
Everybody
bit
ran
in it.
out to see that.
Oh,
It
yeah.
was great.
And they would fly right out.
And they always did a little dip toward the plane. I guess they knew everybody was watching.
Our factory was the Canadian car plant in Fort William, which grew in a few short years from a minor league operation with a couple hundred workers to the biggest darned aircraft builder in the whole wide Dominion. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Our story begins in 1938, when war was just a rumor and Canadian Car hired a spunky little lady from the West to be chief engineer. Elsie Mcgill was her name, aircraft design was her game, and the news hounds loved her. Seemed every news weekly in the country wanted to do a story on her. An American comic book made her an official folk hero, along with General de Gaulle and a cannon-firing dog. They called Elsie the Queen of the Hurricanes. But that was later, of course. Did I mention she grew up in Vancouver?
Daddy, I want to study electrical engineering.
But Elsie, that's a man's work.
Nonsense. If it's what she wants, she'll do it.
What's the world coming to? A girl taking electrical engineering?
How does it feel to be the only girl in a class of 30 boys?
Go home to your knitting!
I don't mind your kidding. It won't stop me.
Miss Elsie Mcgill, our first woman engineer.
Hurrah for Elsie!
And they call those the good old days? Don't you believe it? Now, our Miss Elsie didn't exactly rise from the gutter. She had just about every advantage a girl in those days could get.
Her mother, the judge, the first woman judge in Canada, was a friend of my grandmother who lived on Vancouver Island, and her mother was the founder of the University Women's Club. Elsie and Helen took drawing lessons with Emily Carr, and that was mostly because they wanted to help Emily Carr earn a living, not because they thought their daughters had any talent. So they were a very involved, progressive family in British Columbia.
If we were being formal, my sister and I, we called her Aunt Elsie, but most of the time we called her Aunt Bonky. Yeah, she was an unconventional woman. She she decided to be an engineer. And then, of course, she also had polio, and so she had a physical handicap. And that also made her a source of scorn to some people. And I know that my grandmother was approached by somebody who I think was a neighbor, and Elsie had been engaged at that time, and the mother said, well, of course my son can't marry somebody who's handicapped. So it was a very different world for both to be a professional woman and to be somebody who had had polio and survived and went right on with the career.
Dear family, I have accepted the job of chief engineer in Fort William at $350 per month. If I make good, I will be on top of the world. To be chief engineer at 33 years of age is not bad.
Well, Elsie, there goes the training plane you designed. It will be known as the Mcgill Trainer.
Why, thanks, Dave, but I don't want glory. I'm happy to see it fly.
So she designs this dandy little kite, which is swell. But of course, all the newsboys can talk about is how a little slip of a woman can do such a he-man's job. But like the lady says, as long as they spell your name right, I suppose. Anyway, all this put Elsie and Canadian Car in a mighty pretty spot when the Royal Air Force came looking for someone to build their planes.
more planes are needed, and in her Fort William office, Elizabeth Mcgill takes her place in the front rank of Canada's aircraft designers.
There's Elsie. Young she looks. Yeah, I wonder how old she was.
Lady.
More planes are needed.
Building all these fancy fighters was going to take a lot more workers than Cancar had ever seen. But the workers were going the other way, into uniform and off to war. So the call went out, and in came the women. When these ladies first came through these gates, they were hardly more than girls. Margaret Cook was only 16, and in those days, she was Margaret Nixon.
Margaret Nixon. That's right. Over there. Number 5832 is my card number.
There we go.
Thank you. Now, where was my wages? I started at 30 cents.
What was mine here?
$20 a week.
Boy.
Wow.
This kid had looks.
$80 a month.
Why did you come to the plant? Why did you look for work
Well,
at Cancar?
My mother was ill, and I got tired of being a domestic engineer, and I thought I'd go look for a job.
When we were young, the war...
There was no money.
There was no money. We just come through the dirty 30s.
Yeah.
And it was a struggle to make ends meet in the 30s.
And
very few people had dough for
and
university.
Most of the girls couldn't go. You went to grade 8, and if you got out of grade 8, there was no money to go to high school, so you worked at St. Joe's for $10 a month, or you did housework for $10 a month.
Must have been a lot better money to be a welder.
Yes, it was, as you can well see.
Yes.
Well, my mother was a widow from the time I was 4 years old, so she was on a mother's allowance of $50 a month. Took my first paycheck home, and it was so big that I thought it was wonderful for my mother, eh? So I wrote my check out, signed it, and give it to my mother, and she started to cry. That was the first bit of real money that she's had for a long time.
For goodness sake.
Yeah, because she was a widow, you see.
Maybe 200 people built that first hurricane, and they managed to get it up and flying by January 1940. A year later, 3,000 workers were turning out 20 planes a week, and 500 of us were women.
There we go.
Nice to meet you all.
Shirley Butterfield stole my dolly.
We broke ground for you.
And on the inside.
And in the inside. Oh, I can see the bead.
Looking at it today, it's hard to wrap your brain around just what a shock it was for the men to have all those women move into their shop. Because if you think it's a man's world now, honey, you should have seen it then. The way those fellas carried on, you'd think it was the boys' gym and we'd just barged into the locker room.
My wife works, people think I can't support her.
Oh, I don't mind my wife working, but who's going to run my home?
It's okay now, but what about after the war? The women will have all the jobs.
You could see that they just didn't feel we should be there. But then we made them understand that we were taking the place of the men that were at war, and they were taking the place because they couldn't go to war.
They'd get to the time clock before we did. They'd go and punch before, and then we'd have to line up. Then they'd make it out to the streetcars and buses.
And we were always about 5 minutes behind.
Yeah, so they got the seats and we hung by the straps.
Make it look like as if we really didn't care.
That's right.
And you know, we were equal. They didn't really realize it, but we were equal to them. We were doing the same jobs.
But
And
mostly
so what?
they didn't
It
really
matter.
accept it, though.
Yeah.
They never accepted that we were equal, I don't think.
We had one that would never let us get punch out before him. And he was really, you could see that he didn't like the idea of women working there. But towards the end, we won him over. We welded his lunch pail to a piece of steel.
They needed us. It was as simple as that. And the things they said to get us were as smooth as a Bing Crosby tune. All of a sudden, all those jobs that were so tough got just as easy as pie.
Employers find that women can do many jobs as well as men. Some jobs better. They discover that factory work is usually no more difficult than housework.
And we all know how easy housework is. And get a load of this.
Light metals used in aircraft are easy for women to handle. When a hand drill weighs heavily on feminine muscles, the lazy arm drill is introduced to take off the strain. Here's a new girl.
This is your stop.
But plenty of fellas were pretty good at sports, and they meant well enough. So if it made them feel good to think we were helpless, why, from time to time, we let them.
This is the wheel for winding the table across.
Don't forget, most of them have never seen the inside of a manufacturing plant. Here one girl is teaching another how to operate a Jones and Lamson turret lathe. This is one of the most interesting discoveries made in training women. They actually learn better from other girls already trained rather than from men instructors.
The fellow that trained me, Charlie Greenwood, he screamed at me and everybody used to laugh about me and Charlie because I was so nervous in there, you know. And I couldn't learn anything from him because he was such a bully and he didn't have any patience with me, you know, to learn. So we were much better for teaching, I must say. I said, I'm not going to be like him, you know, so we were good.
Sure, we were good as any man. But when it came to getting paid...
The government's policy is that women should get the same pay that men get for similar work.
The men that I trained were getting better wages than I was, automatically. That's the way it was, and we had to accept it. I didn't like the idea, but, you know, we had to go with it.
Because at that time, everybody was so dedicated to their jobs and they were so afraid of losing their jobs. This is one of my best jobs.
Among the 500 women at Cancar in 1941, you couldn't miss Elsie Mcgill. She was everywhere, and wherever she was, you knew she was the boss.
We really didn't get to know her. She didn't communicate with us, with the workers.
She sort of gave you the impression that, you know, you wouldn't dare speak to her. She was a very cool, icy person.
She didn't come down very often, but she always had a chip on her shoulder when she did come down. And one day she came down and she wasn't satisfied with the work we were doing, so she just took a knife and slit the plane cover.
Of course, the reporters and propaganda hacks still couldn't see anyone at Canadian Car but Elsie. And the men, who, to give them credit, were working just as hard, started to get their noses out of joint.
It sometimes grated on the nerves of others in the plant because it was seen by most people as being somewhat excessive. They didn't give anybody else any credit, but they gave her a lot.
Did she build it? Yeah, sure, she had a big box full of tools and she went down the shop and when the men weren't there, she made all the parts.
There was always a tendency to distort or to glamorize or to exceed the truth. For example, they described her as coming into the shop frequently and taking some commanding position regarding what was going on in the shop. Well, this never happened.
Like the story of the 7 blind men and the elephant, your impression of Elsie depended on your point of view.
She walked past the wings. She could have had a ride on one of those chaser carts or something, you know, but I think she chose to. And I'm glad she did. She let us know who she was by doing that, you know, instead of just hearsay.
She was the boss. It was a man's world, let's put it that way, and most of the engineers that, you know, we ever heard of were male engineers, so for her to be in that position, I would say that was, to us, it, you know, it was, we stood in awe of it.
She was like almost like the first man on the moon for the women. She made a breakthrough for us into engineering, and we liked that.
Outside of Elsie, women bosses in those days were harder to find than a new pair of nylons. Oh, if you worked in a department that was all women, maybe. But out on the shop floor? Don't make me laugh.
If you walked in the assembly line, there was really more women that were doing the job. And I imagine some of them could have been bosses, and good ones too. But that's the way it was in those days, you know. We had the men that were leadmen, as they called them, and we never thought of that. We just thought we were brought in to do our job for our country, and it was welding, and nobody thought of being promoted or, you know, it was just your job.
I don't know why the men were the bosses, but I think it was because they had more experience. And my husband had started in 1939 with the Grumman, and he had a couple of years' experience on, you know, he worked up into the job. That's where he became the lead man. But this is what they tried to do, was to have the experience. It doesn't matter whether you were a man or a woman, but you had to have experience. But I never stayed long enough to become a lead hand myself, because I got married. And once you got married, you couldn't work. You lost your job.
This was the place for a gal with a family, because of course you couldn't be a wife and mother and still hold down a job. But if Papa was away fighting, making ends meet could be pretty tough. So plenty of women just lied about hubby and Junior and went to work anyway. And without daycare, a girl with kids just had to use her imagination. What some of them came up with would curl your hair faster than a permanent wave. Hold on, Junior. Mama will be back before you know it. But if the bosses wouldn't take care of our kids, our girlish reputations were a different matter. A lot of folks spent a lot of time worrying about what would happen with so many young women working near so many fellas. Hard-working fellas with big muscles, and only one thing on their minds, or so the bosses thought. So to make sure everything stayed on the up and up, they came up with a kind of combination nurse, nanny, and cop. The matrons.
I was underneath the wing one time in that position where you had to buck the river backwards, and my hat came off, and she came along and says, "Put your hat on," she says. And here I am, and working away like, you know, "Put your hat on," she said.
They were just looking for trouble, and we were, you know, just doing our job, and we didn't want to be bothered with them.
The matrons also accomplish wonders in keeping up morale. Girls have troubles. It isn't necessary to cater to those troubles. It's merely necessary to recognize them and provide intelligent, likable, friendly women to help and advise the girls.
Would they have a man matron? No, nothing like that. It was just for the women to keep us in line, you know, so we wouldn't tempt the men. We're virgins. Till after the war, for heaven's sakes. I was 21 years old, but, you know, don't want to bring any babies home to your mother to raise.
Both Mary and I didn't have a father figure. My dad died when I was 4. My mother never remarried. So it was very unusual to be with all these men, not knowing anything. You had to make sure that you didn't disgrace your family. And your mother was the key figure in your life, so you wouldn't want to do anything that would hurt her. And Mary says, well, there's no way you'd want to bring a baby home, that's for sure. So,
which was happening, yes.
Yeah, which happened then too, but we all seemed to get along really well. Then maybe that's why we were so dedicated to our job. And that's why we didn't need anybody hanging over our heads.
There was another reason we were dedicated. Our boys were over there, some of them flying the planes we built, and they weren't always coming back.
Well, somebody'd come into work in the morning and you could tell, you know, their eyes would be all swollen, their faces red, and sometimes they would phone the plant like it was someone close, and Mr. Stewartson or Mr. Carpenter or Kells would walk up and take you into the office and sit you down and tell you that so-and-so had been lost, and of course you went home then.
I don't remember if anybody, you probably knew the Jessmans.
Very well.
Well, I was going
All three of them.
with Bill.
Oh.
And he was killed on a Monday. And on a Friday, his young brother was killed. Scotty was killed on a Friday. So that was the most saddest day of our lives.
Every week, the casualty lists brought the war right into our homes.
Made you feel like building them bigger and better, so you could get the guys that are doing this. You know, of course, we all thought the war was going to be over in a year or two. You know, we didn't think it was going to last as long as it did. Everybody had the best thoughts it was just going to be a year, but of course it lasted a lot longer.
By the middle of 1942, the Hurricane was being phased out as a frontline fighter. We'd built 1,400 of them, enough to replace the losses in the Battle of Britain twice over. But now the orders stopped coming. We were going to have to find another plane to keep us in business. Well, by this time, Uncle Sam had finally been dragged into the war, and now their factories couldn't keep up with all the new planes they needed. So, just like the British, they came to us. The new plane was the Helldiver bomber, and it was so new they hadn't even finished designing it.
Even as we unpacked the blueprints, changes were coming. Modifications coming from St. Louis, I think it was, and changes were being made constantly, even before they started tooling up. And that's when they needed more help in the office. That's when I went into engineering to help into the blueprints, and you know, you'd barely get it set up and it would all change again.
There's no way around it. The Helldiver was a bit of a pig at first. The boys who flew it named it the Beast. The engineers at Curtis just couldn't seem to get it right.
Frustration a lot, because you'd just get, they'd change some little part and you'd just get everything set up to go, and there'd be another EO, they call them engineering orders, coming in, and you'd have to change it.
Before it was over, they'd sent us 10,000 engineering orders that called for 50,000 changes. It stretched everybody to the breaking point. And when the axe fell, it landed on the plant manager, Mr. E.J. Soulsby.
Well, my understanding was that at that time, there were 4 or 5 senior naval men, and he was taken around the plant, and I guess they were asking him some questions. They didn't like what he said, and so he was gone, just like that.
Mr. E.J. Soulsby was out, but he didn't go alone. There was another pink slip for Elsie Mcgill.
There was a representative, a senior representative from the company who met, I believe, Mr. Soulsby and Miss Mcgill in the hotel, and read a letter to them from the president dismissing their services, but I don't think they knew anything about it before that.
And taking Soulsby's position was none other than Joe Russell, and taking Elsie Mcgill's position was none other than myself.
She and Soulsby were walked out the main gate, and she was terminated. The reason they gave us at the time, and all I heard, was that she was not on schedule with the Curtis Helldiver.
Well, they were both respected highly for their performance of their duties. I'm sure there was no criticism of them, although there is a parallel rumor that Soulsby had been impolite to a visiting Navy dignitary, and that brought about his downfall, but that, I think, is a rumor. But I don't think it related to their work at all.
So what was the real story behind the firing of Elsie Mcgill? Don't touch that dial. The first Curtis Helldiver rolled out of Canadian car in July of 1943. Just about the same time, the trains started rolling in, bringing the thousands more women, mostly from the prairies, who were going to build them. There were so darn many of them, Cancar had to build its own barracks.
To the right there, the large white building is Canadian Car and Foundry, where it's now Bombardier. It was Canadian Car and Foundry. Across the street from there, the 4 little buildings with the black windows, that's Winston Hall, and that was built to accommodate all the ladies that came out here from Western Canada. There was some 3,000-4,000, I believe, came from the West here, many of which became friends of mine, good friends of mine.
Over the next year, they just kept hiring until there were 7,500 people working 3 shifts. Just about 3,000 of us were women. I'll tell you, fellas, the rate we turned out those planes, that factory wasn't just humming, it was up on its hind legs and wailing.
Smoke was blue, but you never had a mask, and you just did your test, and that was it.
And the air was just like, you know.
Yeah, there wasn't any air conditioning.
There was a skylight, and when the sun shone, you'd see all these diamonds in the air, you know.
You had to really wear your goggles and have something right across your forehead, because the heat would sort of burn it.
Could you imagine all the noise that would be taking place? You'd be hearing this, and then the next thing you'd hear the drill going. You'd be drilling holes, then you'd be riveting, you know, so it was noisy, really noisy. We got used to it. We loved it.
You know, I worked a double shift. I'd get off at 12 o'clock, go to bed, and I'd dream I was riveting all night. Wake up in the morning and hey,
hey, we're going back to work.
But all work and no play makes Jane an old maid, right? What's life without a dance? How about every night?
There's the old dance. You look at one and they all look alike.
Don't they?
And it must have been the hairdo.
I wish they had taken us when we were dancing and better looking.
And young.
With all these young men asking us for dances.
We had a great time.
We had a ball.
Oh, we never missed it.
Wouldn't you love to see yourself up there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wouldn't know me.
Yeah, maybe I wouldn't recognize myself.
Never mind, Mary, you're still playing the violin.
They made this movie in England, but it catches the time just the way it was, or maybe the way we wish it was.
They take an hour for dinner in the middle of the night.
Some of these days, you're gonna miss me hardly. Some of these days, you're gonna be so.
Keep your eye on this smoothie, ladies.
Riveter, and I was his helper. How about that? So actually, when he first asked me for a date, I said, no, I don't go out on dates. His face just dropped. So, you know, I felt bad after it, because he wasn't that type of fellow.
You should have asked me. I had a crush on him, too. He was my lead man. He was a wonderful person.
And so, actually, that's when I start putting my fingers through the gun bay, and I'd hold his. He'd put his finger out to hold the rivet to show me which one. I'd put my finger in and hold his finger. So I guess that's what started it all.
Factory romance has got to be as common as ration coupons. But it would be 50 years before some of the gals got the lowdown on the most scandalous romance of them all. In all the talk of whatever happened to what's-her-name and who married whom, the subject of Elsie Mcgill just has to come up.
She used to scare us when she walked down the aisles. She looked sort of fierce.
And then the full story of her and E.J. Soulsby comes out. Seems there was more to getting fired than production deadlines.
They walked her out of the plant and they walked Soulsby out of the plant at the same time.
That was the scandal.
Yeah.
And
but that's
but
what
I didn't know they got married.
Oh, I didn't either.
Hardly a week after they were fired, Elsie and E.J. announced their wedding. The can car rumor mill hit full boil.
As I say, we were all, it was like an earthquake went around when we heard that those two were a pair or an item. You look at two people like that, you would never figure there was anything romantic at all, and it just sort of floored everybody.
The rumor in the cities was that they were seeing more than they should of each other. In today's situation, that might not be considered reprehensible, but it was in them days.
My mother died in September, and Dad and Elsie were married in June or July. I never remember which. And we were a family. She was very strong on family.
So Cupid raises his curly head and the nasty old bosses pour cold water all over it. Sounds like another sad case of mixed up male priorities.
It was not a great crisis in their lives. I think they looked on it a bit with humor, because the man who did subsequently get my father's job, he subsequently got fired too, and I can remember there being a considerable amount of hilarity around their dinner table about that. So, and Elsie, I think, had wanted to open her own consulting office anyway. I think this was sort of part of her long-range plan, and so that was a good time to do it.
After the boys landed in Normandy, things went pretty fast. Rough as they had it, by early 1945 it was pretty clear the war was going to end after all. Yipes! All of a sudden all us heroines were a big liability, and they let us know it. The propaganda boys got back to work and started cramming the toothpaste back into the tube.
My boy's family is looking forward to peace now. My daughter-in-law to her old job, a wife. But a better wife and a better citizen because of her wartime experience.
Are you going to keep on working?
I should say not. When my husband comes back, I'm going to be busy at home.
Good for you.
Well, this job belongs to some soldier. When he comes back, he can have it. Oh, that's swell.
Swell or not, we were stuck with it. The layoffs began even before VJ Day. Most of us did what we'd always done, made the best of it.
I was one of the longest serving members of the can car crew, so I had seniority. And therefore, they had to find me work if there was any to be done. And that's how we got into this war asset thing while they were tooling up for Brill. And then we started working back in the plant on buses. And I worked in the engineering department on buses for a long time. Many of the ladies did. But those that were doing things like riveting and that, there was just no opportunity for them for jobs anymore. There was a few of them in the plant, but very, very few. In the meantime, the servicemen were coming home, and they should and did get top priority for jobs.
It didn't bother me, because it was time for me to go on with my life anyway. So actually, I accepted everything. It was great. Yeah.
And I was out for a year in the sanatorium, and my sister asked me to go to BC, and so I quit and went out there for my health. So, you know, we're not typical that way. No. A lot of the girls that came from out west, they were devastated when the war was over. They had, you know, their wages stopped, and, you know, they had to cope with it.
In a lot of cases, it would be their first jobs, too. And they should have, you know, really been looking forward to going on. And then you were sort of deprived because they didn't need you anymore, and there was nothing else for you to do.
I think what I did, I sort of gave myself some esteem and went on and did other things. From here I went to the Great Lakes. And no, but we had a tremendous lady. May I speak about her? I started the same day as her. Her name was Alvina Boat. That girl, she continued, and she went into electric welding, and she was just remarkable. She stayed on till she was 65.
Last hired, first fired. Out of the thousands of women on the shop floor, the company kept 3. Elsie Mcgill had been gone 2 years by the end of the war, but the can car women wouldn't forget the Spitfire, who was queen of the hurricanes.
It gave us thought that, gee, if she can do it with her difficulties, why couldn't we all do the same thing? And, you know, I think it made a lot of young women think about higher education to see her have done so well, even against all odds.
After the war, Elsie took on women's rights wherever she went. In 1968, she was appointed to the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. Then she helped found the National Action Committee to make sure the Royal Commission was effective.
Every single night she would phone me. My husband used to groan because the phone would ring as soon as we were sitting down for dinner. And it would be Elsie. And she never said, "This is Elsie." She said, "Lorna, have you got a pencil? Now write this down. This is what you have to do." You know, and she'd read all the newspapers. She'd read Hansard. She knew what was happening. She knew who we had to get to. And you've got to do it now. Here's what you say in the letter. She was quite determined to make this a powerful force, to make sure that the Royal Commission had an impact. And I think if you look at the recommendations of the Royal Commission now, you will find that they have all either been implemented or history has passed them by. They no longer have to be implemented. So I think she was one of the people who entirely changed the nature of this country, legally, economically, and certainly in terms of the quality of life.
Those 1,400 hurricanes and 800 hell divers we built changed a few things too, and helped win the war. But the biggest change might have been the one they made in us.
Did you like working on the plane?
Yes, because it was very important work.
How old were you when you were doing that?
I started when I was 15. I just turned 15. And when I first went down to work for the fella that I was to help, I think he felt very, you know, like this little slip of a girl coming to help him, and he didn't talk much, and he just kept busy. And after a while, when he saw that I was very serious about my work, then he said, "You should get equal pay and go to the tool crib and get some gloves so that you won't hurt your hands when you're holding that," and all this sort of stuff. And he was an
But you had to prove yourself first.
Well, it took a little bit, but they weren't hard on me.
She's always said all her life, to me anyway, you can do anything that you put your mind to and anything that you want to do. So after I got married and had kids and stayed home for 10 years, I decided that I could go back to teaching, get my degree, do things like that, because she always told me anything I wanted to do, I could do.
Did you get that?
Carrier fan, these.
Yes, the 2 bushings here, you see. There's the flange and there's the bushing.
Very proud.
But all in all, it was the greatest experience, I think, of our lives.
That was a wonderful
And
opportunity.
you really never forgot it. You knew you had done something and done something worthwhile.
I'm certainly proud I worked on that plane.
Tell you what, let's take that pillow out of the way. Let it there you go.
Thank you.
You're great.
Oh, that was wonderful. true.
Did you enjoy that?
I enjoyed every minute. It was wonderful.
Well, I was hoping you were still back there, so I didn't hear anything, so I knew you were okay. No screaming. It's my pleasure and my privilege. So, ladies, I wish it could have been everybody.
Yeah, that's the way I like it.